Hello and welcome to another edition of The Front Page on GNAT TV. My name is Andrew McKeever, the managing editor of the Manchester Journal. It's my pleasure to be your host today. It's my pleasure to also have back with us here in the studio William Schmick, who is an occasional columnist with the Journal, and his full-time job is as an investment portfolio advisor with Berkshire Money Management in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. And Bill, it's a pleasure to have you back again.
Thank you for inviting me. I love coming to this place.
Well, last time, folks will remember, we talked a bit about retirement,
Yes.
retirement issues, Social Security system, when should people start planning for retirement. Today we're going to take a look at the sort of the broader economic trends that are going on, not only in the U.S., but around the world as well. Just to kind of get things started, I guess what we have here in the U.S., I think probably most folks would agree, is a slowly recovering economy from the Great Recession that began in 2007, 2008. I think most people will say, well, 2008 is when the Lehman Brothers investment firm fell and
Right.
Wall Street collapsed and so forth and so on. Since then, we've seen sort of a gradual recovery. Last week, we had a jobs report of 142,000 new jobs being created. Yeah, it sounds like a good number, but maybe what's going on is sort of a more nuanced picture where the unemployment rate is declining because more folks are leaving the job market rather than folks coming in. So it still seems, I think, like we have kind of a murky picture out there where the economy isn't really perking along at the rates that I think just about anybody would like to see. But what's your forecast? What's your take on it? You follow this stuff a lot more closely than most of the rest of us do. What would you say the forecast for the U.S. economy is going to be in the next 6 to 12 months or so?
Gangbusters.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
I'm
Well, that's
already
refreshing.
seeing it. Yes. We'll talk about the economy overall. All of the leading indicators that I follow are flashing green lights. If I look at the manufacturing data, it's called ISM, okay? Of 18 manufacturing sectors, 17 are in the positive now. We're getting better readings now than we have since, I guess, 2011. Housing construction, as you know, is really picking up. But even more important is non-residential construction. That's things like highways and infrastructure and plant and equipment. That is really starting to pick up, and that's a very, very good sign. Now, granted, the consumer spending, I think, is 67% of GDP, okay? That has not picked up as much. In the second quarter, it was probably up a little over 2%. We'd like to see that more towards 4%. But other parts of the economy are picking up the slack, okay? So if I just looked at all the leading economic indicators that are coming out right now, it would look like a 5% GDP number, but it's not. We'll probably see 2.8, 2.9%, maybe even 3% in the next 6 to 12 months overall. Now that'd be a very strong number, but as you pointed out, if we look through history, that's just a moderate increase, okay? And we're not talking yet about unemployment, but why? Here we are, you referred back to 2008. It's 2014, and we're only now getting to a 3% GDP number. Two reasons. Number one, unlike all the other recessions that we've seen in our lifetime, this has been a credit recession. There's a big difference between a credit recession and our normal, everyday run-of-the-mill recession. I'll give you an example. The normal run-of-the-mill recession lasts 1.5 to 2.5 years. Why does that happen? Basically, in this economy, using a can of beans, corporations manufacture too many cans of beans. And we love beans, and we eat beans to the point where we're beaned out.
Right.
So then what happens is the inventory of bean cans grow and grow and grow, and we pass on the beans. And so it takes a while, 1.5 to 3 years, to work down those cans. We're still going to eat the beans, just not like we did before.
Right.
That's a typical recession. Okay? That's not what we had in 2008. We had a financial crisis where the credit, not only of this country, but the credit of the banks, the credit of the brokerage houses worldwide was called into question. Even our currency was called into question. When was the last time we had a credit crisis like this?
1930s.
Yes,
Right.
the Great Depression. Think, how long did the Great Depression last? Well, from 1932 until we entered World War II, 8, 9 years. Now, how long has ours lasted? All right, we're in our 5th or 6th year. Actually, when you're talking about a credit crisis, we're not doing bad at all, okay? We would have done a lot better, excuse me for the politics, if we had our political parties do anything at all to assist the Federal Reserve in trying not only to stave off the Second Great Depression, but also to grow the economy. I think what the Fed has done single-handedly is a miracle, okay? And my blame goes to Congress.
Okay. Well, just by coincidence, we happen to be in an election season cycle, or about to start into one. What effect is that going to play, do you think, on economic growth over the next 2 to 3 months? Will political parties be jockeying for advantage, and will the government be trying to prime the pump maybe too aggressively, or?
Well, in a midterm election year, okay, you've noticed how extraordinarily quiet both parties have been, and a lot of issues that we thought were going to be burning issues, such as Obamacare, okay, which is, we're not seeing it, okay? In fact, we're not seeing the politicians at all. Where are they? Okay, well, the only politicians we're hearing about are those that are going to be running in 2016, right?
Yeah, I guess
Okay.
so, yeah.
So in a sense, this whole political question for November, we have yet to hear it. Maybe we won't hear it, okay? Will it have any effect on the economy over the next 3 to 4 months? No. It might have an effect on the stock market, but no, not on the economy. It seems as if in Washington, D.C., all eyes are on 2016, and 2014 is an afterthought.
Do you think the polarization of the political process, which I think you were alluding to there a moment ago, is going to continue on into 2015? I mean, to the point where instead of a sort of far-reaching grand bargain, let's say, that might lower corporate tax rates in exchange for, you know, eliminating loopholes, one idea that's been broached many times, but the political parties can't ever seem to kind of get to yes on that one, or even just, you know, getting through to adopting spending resolutions. You know, we had a government shutdown last year. We've got another spending resolution that's has to be passed by, I think, October 1st of this year, not too far away.
Right.
Is that kind of paralysis going to continue to hobble
Yes.
economic growth in the country?
I'm afraid so. Like the midterm election, all eyes are on 2016. Whether or not the Republicans gain the Senate or not, okay, and I have no idea whether they will, depends on the poll, the flavor of the month.
Right.
I do not believe anything is going to happen until 2016 in the legislative world.
So the business world and the economy, it's kind of,
Well,
they're on their own.
and that's good for the stock market. Believe it or not, that the two things are funny. That paralysis is good for the stock market, and the reason why is because if there's going to be no change, then investors can look ahead and extrapolate that there will be no change from left field via legislation, so it's business as usual without worrying about what's happening in Washington, D.C.
Right.
Okay, so that's great news. The other funny thing is that if you look back through history, and everyone considers Wall Street Republican, okay, the stock market has done worse under Republican administrations than it has under Democratic administrations for eons, for a long, long time. And you might, I see all that look. Why would that be?
Well, yeah, is that coincidental? Or?
No, it isn't. The Republicans are constantly calling Democrats the party of spending, right?
Right.
Okay, and the Democrats are calling the Republicans the party of stinginess. Okay, and it is to some extent true. So that under a Republican administration, spending is less. Okay, under a Democratic administration, spending is more. Spending is more, then there's more productivity, there's more growth, there's maybe also more inflation and more deficits and on and on and on. But in fact, it's good for the
In the short term
business.
anyway,
Yes,
yeah, right.
exactly.
So, okay, so you're thinking the stock market is going to have a pretty good year in 2015, I guess.
Yes, yes.
Any particular sectors that are more promising than others, do you think?
Well, it depends on what happens with interest rates, okay?
Okay.
If you take the banks, for example, the financial sector, when interest rates start to climb, okay, banks can loan money to people at a higher rate of interest. They borrow lower and they lend higher. Now, for years now, we've had practically non-existent interest rates, and so the banks haven't been really able to make that what we call arbitrage. So if we do begin to see long-term interest rates start to rise, then the banking sector will profit from that, okay? And after all, their bread and butter business should be loaning to businesses and individuals, and they haven't, as I said, been able to do that. Cyclicals would be industrials. They seem always to do very well when the economy starts to accelerate. So that would be the Dow Jones Industrial Average. So you could expect the Dow and its components to do very well as the economy continues to grow. Technology does well too. Certain kinds of technology do even better than others. So if you take the old technologies of semiconductors and Microsoft kind of, Apple kind of companies, they aren't growing as fast as something like a Facebook, okay, but they're larger and they're in a lot of pockets. So as the economy grows and the pockets get wealthier, then they get more and more out of those pockets. So they seem to also be doing better. Okay.
All right. Well, let's turn then to the global economy, you know, the really big picture.
Yeah.
It seems like such a mixed bag. I mean, the basic narrative of the past couple of years has been the rise of China, Asian economies, kind of the relative decline or stagnation in Europe, U.S. sort of, you know, gradually easing out of recession. Is that basic picture, do you think, going to remain the same for the next 6 to 12 months? I mean, there's been a lot of unrest, it seems to me, going on in Asia, with the rise of China sort of asserting itself more as at least a regional power over there. And we'll also want to talk about, you know, some of the crises that are going on in the Middle East, Syria, Iraq, Ukraine. But how do you see, well, let's start with Asia. Do you see them continuing to be a bigger and bigger part of the global economy and just an absolutely, you know, it's going to be hard for the U.S. to kind of, you know, maintain itself as like the world's largest economy, I would say. Fairly soon, I think China is going to overtake us in that area.
They may. What's happening worldwide? Okay, I took a look last week. Of 34 central banks that I follow, 50% of them, okay, have been reducing their interest rates, okay? In fact, 50% of them are actually giving their investors a negative rate of interest. What does that mean? That means that the interest rate that they're offering you on their sovereign debt, their government debt, is actually negative, okay? So if you take Japan and Hong Kong, if you take the interest rate minus the rate of inflation equals the real rate, okay? So Japan and Hong Kong right now have the lowest real rate of inflation, real rate of return of any country in the world, minus 3.2%. In other words, buying government debt in Japan, you lose 3.2%. If you take it to the United States and Canada, we're at minus 1%, meaning if you buy a U.S. Treasury bond, a 30-year Treasury bond, and you subtract out the rate of inflation, you're getting minus 1%. In other words, you're paying the Treasury to buy their bonds. Yes, yes. Now, why would such a ludicrous thing continue to happen? Well, remember, let's go back to the credit crisis. Okay, the whole idea behind our Federal Reserve and other central banks is to reduce the rate of interest, keep it low, keep it low, keep it low. Not only to entice you, okay, to do things like borrow money and then buy a house or borrow money and build plant and equipment or whatever. This process has been going on all over the world to get us out of this credit crisis, because it wasn't just in the United States. It had a domino effect all over the world. So when you have that many central banks shoveling money into their systems, okay, some of it is going to stick, and it's starting to stick, okay? Now, in Asia, they've been doing this, okay? Now, you mentioned China. China is a unique example because China, during the last, 20 years, has been a story of export growth, wondrous export growth, 12% growth a year. Just
staggering numbers,
stop.
yeah.
But about 3 or 4 years ago, something happened on the way to the party. The Chinese government, which controls the economy or tries, decided that it's enough is enough of being an export-led economy. We've got all these billions of people, and imagine what would happen if we switch from export-led to a domestic consumer-led economy. And that's what they've been doing for 3 or 4 years. Well, as you would expect, exports dropped, okay? Growth in the economy has dropped as they move their efforts to build consumer-oriented restaurants and food processors or things and so forth like that. So over the last 3 or 4 years, the economy has been going like that, still growing at 7.5%, but not 12. And the stock market has reflected that and come down in price. One of the cheaper markets in the world. I happen to like China now, okay? I mean, it's still not 100% a go, but for risk-oriented people, China to me is interesting. Imagine if they do succeed in converting from an export to a consumer-driven economy. They have more consumers than just about any country.
Well, let me interrupt you there and ask, would that be good news for U.S. exporters? I mean, because one of the big narratives is, the Chinese are sending all this cheap stuff over here, we buy it, putting American workers out of jobs, plants closing, et cetera, et cetera.
Reverse.
So
the reverse, okay? And as that consumer-led economy becomes wealthier, and it would, then they'll seek higher quality goods, which we make, and Germany makes, and other developed markets make. So China looks interesting to me, but it's a horse of a different color. Now, let's move over to Japan. Japan has come through 25 years of a stagflating economy. It's been the lost double decade, okay, with an aging population. And over the last 20 years, there had been various efforts in order to get the economy out of deflation, which is prices are dropping and dropping and dropping. And since people believe that prices will continue to drop, why buy anything now? Because it'll be cheaper next month. And that's a self-fulfilling prophecy, and slower and slower and slower and slower. And that's what's happened. It's very, very hard to get an economy out of a deflationary cycle. But Japan, their new prime minister of a couple of years ago, Abe, had decided enough was enough. I've lived in Japan. I was actually a Fulbright fellow there. And one of the things I've discovered through history was that the Japanese, when faced with a national challenge, respond to it. Think about it. World War II, devastated. Okay, and then what happened in the 1950s? The Japanese miracle, right? The transistor and all the rest, they completely changed themselves. The same thing actually happened before that in the Meiji Restoration in the 1800s, where they were invaded by industrial countries from the West, okay, and they were still wielding samurai swords, and within one generation they had developed steamships and rifles and cannons and became a world force. So when faced with it, the Japanese rise to the challenge. What was the last one? Fukushima, right? The floods, the nuclear disasters. I wrote a column back then, I think it was 2011, where I said, this is the turning point, okay? The sun rises again, and it has. And the national will was to get out of this deflationary stagnation. So their central bank, taking a leaf out of our central bank's book, started to pump money into their economy, just wheelbarrows full, okay? They started buying government debt, tons of it, okay? Well, it's actually starting to work. Now, in their country, they actually want to see the inflation rate grow to, say, 2.5%. It's now about 1.6%. After 3 years of just pushing the money in there. The jury is still out on whether this grand experiment by the Japanese is going to work. Okay, it's similar to the idea behind the Chinese, okay, with their switch from export to consumer. I guess I'm an optimist. I'm believing that they'll win. Okay, that this stimulation will continue, and that would be two economies around the world, huge economies around the world that seem to be on the upswing, and ours is already. So it gives me hope and optimism towards what is happening globally, not only in the economies but in the stock market. But Ukraine and the other, that you mentioned
they're
those.
kind of wild cards, I guess, and I guess that would lead us then into the other big economic zone to be concerned about. That's Europe, or the Eurozone economies, which, from my point of view, never seem to have really gotten on track again after they got derailed in 2008. I mean, they've been through a very sluggish period. You know, incredible rates of unemployment, particularly among young people, and in some of the countries, Spain, Italy. You know, you've got an unusual situation with Germany apparently doing well, but you know, they're also seeming to show some softening now as well. French economy very stagnant. British economy starting to pick up a little bit, but you know, really still kind of not out of the woods yet. And they're in a very vulnerable situation with the Ukrainian situation because of their need for natural gas from Russia. So put that all together, and do we have any reason to think the Eurozone is going to be following the example of the U.S. and the Asian countries?
Well, Andrew, you put your finger on it, because you said following the example of us and the Asian countries. Europe is not a single monolith, okay? It is 18 members of the European community. As such, unlike the United States or Japan or China, when our central bank decides to pump money, or China pump money and buy bonds, it's done. No, not in Europe. You got to get consensus.
A single currency and 18 different governments.
That's right. Yeah. Okay, that's the way it developed. So even though they've seen our example and seen it work, they haven't been able to form the consensus in Europe to do the same thing. So who's the bad man in the situation is Germany, okay? Because of Germany's experience during World War I and World War II, the German people are terrified of inflation, terrified, okay? So anything that they perceive that could possibly cause inflation, they're against, okay? Now, naturally, if you're going to pump money into the economy and buy bonds and stimulate, there is an outside chance that you're going to get inflation. There is in this country, in any other country. It hasn't happened, but just the idea that it could has kept the Germans dragging their feet and saying, no, 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 let's do this much and see what happens. And well, this much again, and this much again, while the United States and Japan and everybody else is just killing it. So what's happened is, you're right, that over the last 5 or 6 years, Europe has struggled. They're still in the bond debt crisis, okay? They still have issues of labor unions and so forth that have held them back. And in fact, instead of growing, they're actually just on the cusp of turning down into recession. Even Germany, the strong man, its gross domestic product this year is flat. Okay, it's not yet negative, but it may turn negative in the second half. So their central bank has gotten a consensus to some point, okay, largely, not because of what I just described, but because of the fear of Ukraine and what might happen, that the economies there are starting to slow even further because people are not optimistic. So just last week, the central bank actually announced that they've cut interest rates to the bone, just like we have now. That still hasn't done the job. So they're inching into bond buying. We've been bond buying for years, okay? They just announced that they will put money to buy asset-backed bonds, okay? They're not sovereign debt. They're not government debt like we've been doing and Japan's been doing. No, it's sort of like corporate debt and covered corporate debt. So it's like, again, inching in, okay, but not really doing what they need to do, because Germany is telling them sovereign debt is still off the table. I don't care what happens in the Ukraine. Now, I believe that personally they'll have to ultimately do that. They'll have to go the full Monty in order to pull their economy out. So what they have just announced last week will probably allow them to inch along, okay, being the poor man of the world until they actually bite the bullet. Now, the Ukraine brings up a whole issue, okay? If I look back through history, Mother Russia has always needed a cushion of countries around Mother Russia to feel stable, to feel okay.
Yeah, they're not going to be invaded by somebody.
Yes. It's just been the way it's always been. Then with the fall of communism, that entire cushion of countries sort of went democratic, independent, okay? So now Vlad, the Putin, has decided that it's time to reestablish this, okay? Now honestly, the Western Europeans know this, okay? They're not saying this, but they know this. So the feelings that I have is that Putin and Russia will ultimately develop that, or try to develop that sphere of influence again, which would include Ukraine, Eastern Ukraine, and probably all of Ukraine over time. Remember that the Ukraine is the breadbasket of Russia, okay? It produces more red wheat than anywhere else in the world. Plus, it's got the naval ports that Russia needs, okay? So this is an issue for Russia, and they're not going to let it go. Now, the risk is, and it's a high risk if I look in history, is that as winter approaches, unless something is resolved in favor of Russia in the Ukraine, then there's a high probability that they'll cut off gas. Or Ukraine will cut off gas if their backs are against the wall and the Europeans flee as they have been fleeing, and the Ukrainians say, okay, this gas is coming through us, you're not supporting us, we're losing, and our back's against the wall, so we're going to cut off gas to you, and there goes 30% of Europe's energy needs in the middle of winter. What that could do to the European economy is very, very serious.
Couldn't the United States step in at that point? And then, I mean, we've been hearing an awful lot about shale gas and production booming here and natural gas being plentiful. What's to stop us from exporting that to Europe where we could then offset that 30%?
Only time and money. We're already actively doing it. The Europeans now belatedly have seen the folly of their ways, and they're urging us to do so. We have, as everyone knows, an enormous amount of natural gas thanks to fracking, okay? I mean, we have more natural gas than I think Saudi Arabia has oil. So we have a surplus of this. Our issue is to distribute it, get the pipelines, get the ports, get the ships, get everything we need in order to export that. And we are rushing to do this. One of the reasons that the Texas energy business is booming is this is why, okay? So all over the United States, we're trying to expand our natural gas ports. We're trying to bring more ships online. All of this takes time. That's the problem. And also gas transmission pipelines to get to the ports, to get all this gas and push it through. Yes, over the next 10 years, 15 years, will we become a net exporter of energy? We already are, but we definitely will. You might say, well, that's great. You know, we'll be a net export, we'll be sending all this natural gas to Europe, and we'll be the Saudi Arabia of the Northern Hemisphere. Well,
we'll be
yes.
Energy independent.
Right, what does that mean to us, okay? If you know what we all assume, if we're energy independent, that the price on the pump is going to go lower. Nah, it isn't going to go lower, okay? All that means is it'll go higher and we'll benefit, okay? How do we benefit? We don't benefit from lower gas prices, but we'll tax them more, okay?
Right.
That's what'll happen. So forget about this thing that you're going to have cheaper gas because we're a major producer and exporter. We won't. But we will have more taxes.
And a side effect, I suppose, of that, and a conversation, I guess, for another time, would be the fact that higher gas prices at the fuel pump would probably encourage the whole renewables economy.
Yes.
I've often thought that the only way you're ever going to really see a robust growth in electric cars, renewables, solar technology, et cetera, is to price fossil fuels at a point where that becomes cost competitive.
And that's exactly what's happening. Now, the natural gas, though, has put a monkey wrench in that because we found so much natural gas that the prices are going down, okay?
Right.
And they're keeping pressure on all those alternatives that you're talking about. No, never mind that natural gas is a lot cleaner than oil to burn, okay, or coal. So there, wherever you go, there's benefits, and here's another thing that, we all decry the end of manufacturing in the United States, okay? Actually, ladies and gentlemen, manufacturing is coming back because natural gas prices are so low. So you can now build plant and equipment, say a chemical plant, and in the United States, and build it cheaper and hire people and still compete with China because you're close to natural gas and it's a cheap fuel. So, fuel is a huge cost variable for manufacturers. So suddenly we're seeing a renaissance in manufacturing because of our cheaper natural gas. So everything is like a two-edged blade. Do you know what I mean?
Nothing clean cut.
Nothing's
anywhere.
clean cut. No.
Right. Well, Bill, we've got a lot of questions we have to go, but the clock on the wall says it's time to go, as the song says. But let's see. All the things we didn't talk about. The local economy, for instance. So many interesting things going on here in New England, from agriculture to high tech, basically.
That's right.
And be interesting to talk about what is the outlook for the northern New England, southern New England economies, whether or not we're going to finally see some job growth here, and maybe more importantly than job growth is wage growth. I mean, that's the one question.
Wage growth.
I think if we could just take another minute or two to talk about wages have been so stagnant for so long. It seems like since 2008, basically, we've seen very little. The ability of the average worker to see an increase in their take-home pay. Few and far between.
Yes.
I mean, are we ever going to break out of that, or are we locked into a cycle now with technology, globalization, that basically makes the days of a 3 or 4% raise each year yesterday's news?
It depends on the sectors. Now, what do I mean by that? The great middle class, okay, is, as we talked last time, is retiring. 250,000 jobs a month, okay? What retires with them, for the most part, are skills, blue-collar skills, manufacturing skills. And the problem is there's no new guys, new women there to take over with those skills. So what's happened since 2008, that's the retirement of the baby boomers, is you've got this growth in part-time jobs and no-skill jobs, service jobs, okay? And then you have hiring in the skilled jobs, the high-skilled jobs, okay? So there's a dichotomy, okay? And the middle ground that we all enjoyed is going, and no students have learned the task, okay? So here's what you have. You have college graduates with degrees in marketing that are working at McDonald's, nothing to McDonald's, they got a job, for 20 grand a year, okay? You have truck driver companies that are offering 25% increases in wages to find a truck driver. You have manufacturers right in this area that are looking for 100,000 workers, okay, and can't find them because the workers aren't skilled. They can't do the jobs. I referred to the chemical manufacturers, the same issues there. So what we have in this country is a structural issue, okay, which is that we've had tons and tons of kids go to college to get degrees there's no jobs to get, okay, other than the cheap jobs, okay, the ones that are minimum wage. All the skills like plumbing, electrician, and all the rest. How long do you wait for a plumber to show up? Or an electrician, or one that knows what they're doing, all right? Forever, okay? Right. Where are they? Well, they're not there. Why? Because everybody's getting marketing degrees and nobody's going to the technical schools to get a skill. Okay? You have no unions any longer, so there's no education. There used to be a situation where you joined a union, you learned a trade, whatever it was, bricklayer, whatever, and that's your education. Now the unions are only what, 16, 15% of the workforce in the United States. So that educational process is gone. Nobody's going to the technical skills. Everybody's trying to get into college with tons of student debt for 30 years afterward with no jobs at the end. Okay?
So doesn't the supply and demand of all this eventually shake out and people are going to say, I can go to college, go heavily into debt, get a degree in marketing that enables me to work at, some fast food operation. Or I can go to plumbing school or electrical school and make $100,000 a year in 2 years.
That's exactly
eventually that calculation, I would think, is going to start to percolate down through and address that imbalance.
One hopes so. The problem with this country is we're full of myths, okay? The myth of college started with John F. Kennedy. Everybody goes to school, gets a degree in science or math, and so we can beat the Russians, okay? So that worked. Everybody says you got to go to college, okay? If you're going to be successful in life, you've got to go to college. Maybe if you went in math or science, you would be successful, but most people don't want to go to math or science. They want to go to something else, marketing or community welfare, and all of that's great, okay? The problem is on the other side, getting a job there are no jobs, okay? So in a way, that whole message of going to college in America today to become a success, to live the dream, is a myth, okay? And we as Americans have to look at myths like that and not look down on someone who is going to a technical school to become a plumber, but to encourage that, okay? We don't do that, okay? Even their friends will look down at them for doing such a thing. Even as you said, 2 years down the line, they're making $120,000 and incorporated their own business and hired 2 or 3 people, okay? That's the dream of success in America today, and we have to change our attitudes towards so much in this country that it's not your daddy's America. And the longer and the faster that we can look that in the eye without blinking and say, okay, so what is it? The better off we'll be.
Well, I guess we'll have to leave it at that, Bill. But thanks again for being with us today and sharing your thoughts and insights on the economy. And thank all of you folks, too, for watching and tuning in today. This has been The Front Page on GNet TV. I'm Andrew McKeever, the managing editor of the Manchester Journal. Been my pleasure. We'll see you again next time.